back to Cooley self and society, and I was thinking, oh yeah, that's it. And then the notion of your work on moral emotions and linking it to the symbolic features as well as linking to pop culture and the movements, and how all of these things are working together. I'd like to reflect and have you all reflect with me a little bit about how emotion fits into the broader theme that President Wingfield has set for us in terms of reimagining the future of work, and particularly reimagining the future of emotion work. And as we need to reimagine, that suggests the combination and the complexity that we've all been hearing in terms of joy, which is distinct from happiness in a number of ways, which is, it's from perhaps all of our perspectives, it's revolutionary potential. Happiness tends to be an event. It tends to be individualized. It is less relational, less collective than the experience, and I would say, coming from an emotion management tradition, grounded in symbolic interactionism, less of a practice. Happiness, we think of joy as being more complex from the beginning, as needing the suffering. And in reflecting on this, I've been thinking that joy is not in spite of suffering, but there is a common, complex connection between suffering and joy. And in the work that I have done in terms of emotional labor in healthcare, workforce, and in emotion management, it's struck that people don't want to focus on the negative emotion because and yet we have studied the negative emotion. So in emotional labor research, we're studying the surface acting that leads to the burnout, to the inauthenticity. However, in my own work over time, the only way I was able to get access to organizations had to go through the power structure in the C-suite. And they didn't want to talk about burnout. If they wanted to talk about any negative feelings at all, they wanted to talk about compassion fatigue, which is a key distinction, because compassion fatigue is an individual problem. Compassion fatigue has to do with the relationship between a care provider and the secondary trauma that comes from listening to the difficult stories and becoming, yes, exhausted, emotionally exhausted. But as the power structure sees that, the imposition, the way to fix it is to send someone to the stress management class, the time management class, the anger management class, depending upon how it's manifesting in a way that is destructive to power in that workforce. And my own story is very recent, as of last night, in experiencing Second City, that had a skit focused on anger management class, where people were court mandated to the anger management class, and they used the experience that we've all had as children, which overnight somehow this is a profound, which is comedy, right? And humor comes and brings us together in that joyful moment, collectively created and in an artistic performance, not full until the agency of the audience reacts in some way to create that full, joyful experience. They used the graduation from the anger management class was the playing of musical chairs. And if any of you can recall what that was, what a great choice. What a great choice. And predictably, everybody's, very individually, because they're individual actors and it was fabulous, experienced anger when they didn't get the chair, right? And now I think about healthcare, I think about our collective political situation, and I also think about most of our workplaces in higher education. And we're in a game of musical chairs. And we are not controlling when or how those chairs keep being taken away. So the anger is going to be there, the frustration is going to be there, and yet I believe that we as sociologists and as sociologists of emotion have the agency and the power to reimagine the future of our work and other people's emotion work. To recognize that the revolutionary potential of joy is because it is not individualized. And where I think in my own field of emotional labor, where we get in trouble is when we forget that we forget what we're there to do. We forget that we're sociologists. And we cannot solve the problems of our institutions by identifying and only focusing on the negative and then attaching that negative to individual lack, individual problem. Right? And yet, as Schuster and Westbrook's paper pointed out, in sociology, we do have an epistemic problem by focusing on the negative, on the problem. And yet, listening to Patricia Collins the other day, which also was reassuring because it was like, oh yeah, she's voicing what's in my head, but I don't have a way to voice it. The work is more than a job. And our work is more than our job. And there has been so much, and especially in my own work, where I have tended toward, till meeting my wonderful colleague Marcy Cottingham, who's a qualitative sociologist, I was trained quantitatively and developed survey research primarily. And that can get you somewhere, the breadth, can get you somewhere, but it can't get you everywhere. And the complexity of it comes back. But in looking at survey data, we add it together, but it's individualized data. It doesn't give us the complexity of what's happening on the job. And as I was telling my friend Linda Francis, we need to go back to the classics and the beginnings of this section and the beginnings of other people in this room and the various theoretical traditions that we have, from affect control theory to symbolic interactionism to emotion management theory to and other emerging theories on different marginalized groups that we were not studying when this section began, and realizing that is our power and that is our agency. We need to work in solidarity with one another. And so, returning to Hochschild, who started my career during my comprehensive exam, actually, because I had just read The Managed Heart and was a family sociologist and was asked a question about divorce and gender and things, and all I did was talk about The Managed Heart and the fact that, well, the women have given too much at work. And so when they come home, they're exhausted. But recently I've had the opportunity to go back and read where it really started, which was Hochschild 1975. And it was not in the context of labor. It was in the context of emotion management and emotion work. The work is more than the job. And introducing that approach, she notes that emotion is subject to acts of management, which we all know, by the self, but then she goes on, and this is quoting from the 1975 piece, within the context of structural positions, always. And she identifies specifically job, sex, age, ethnic background, or religion in that particular piece. And she notes that the structure then goes forward, and then that shapes the status-based cultural expectations. It's always been a little bit of a frustration that, from my perspective, that Hochschild's work has been seen as cultural. Her work is is cultural adjacent, I would say. Her work is structural. And we all know that from page 7 of the Managed Heart, which is the definition of emotional labor, exchange value, and so on. And again, that brings us back to our history of the reimagining. We have to go back, and it's Marx. And Marx knew that meaning and purpose was found in work, not in labor. And that was the distinction that Hochschild drew in distinguishing for us why we must understand the difference between emotion work and emotional labor. And like my colleagues here, it's hard to study this and to distinguish it and to measure it. But I also think it's now time to rebalance what we've been doing and not fear the focus on the positive emotion because of the revolutionary potential. And perhaps, are we our own worst enemies thinking it's frivolous, as opposed to thinking it's the point in what we're doing, which is why it's work and not labor, under the best, most idealistic conditions, of course. And I think that as we do that, we also need to keep in mind there are Anna Greenfield mentioned this the other day as well, there are very few communities and very few individuals, and Goffman pointed this out as well, where we don't have resources of some form. It may not be monetary, but it can be time, and so on. And so we have agency, but we are dealing with large-scale issues of power over right now. And we all know this, we can't combat that one individual agent at a time in our isolated research endeavors. We need to come together and do collaborative work on the borders with other disciplines of like-minded folks and people globally. And this actually comes from Jordan McKenzie, some thinking that I've been doing about this, who's an Australian researcher who specifically focuses on emotional labor in healthcare organizations and focuses on the role of how do we bring healthcare workers together in solidarity, working together. And I want to conclude by, again, hoping that all of you will reflect on your own work in the context of your structural positions. Some just starting out, some in mid-level positions of power over students, over colleagues, if you're a chair like me, and maybe holding administrative positions. And reimagining what that can be like. Because in today's context, where many of us are going back to institutions of higher education, who actually are directly, as we all know, directly under attack, in different ways, depending, again, on the status of our different institutions. And as we all know, and as many of you may have experienced, sociology is in the crosshairs of that. In my own state, we have Senate Bill 1, which is being implemented now, and the words that we cannot use are listed in the law. Diversity, gender, race, climate change, reproductive justice, in the law. So sociology is in the crosshairs. So I just want to encourage us all not to merely do the research part, but to do the work. And what I mean by this is to recognize that when we're researching emotion and bringing our different theoretical perspectives to bear, and hopefully using more than one of those, because that allows for the more complex view of things, that we reflect it back on what we're doing in all of our interactions. Interactions with students, interactions with colleagues, and I do think about Randall Collins, Dirk Hymian, work on interaction ritual and the Durkheimian focus on that of collective effervescence, right? Which is what profoundly makes emotion purely, right? Historically, sociological. And are we keeping in mind that we're not taking the chairs away from each other? Our colleagues across our campuses in other disciplines like engineering and psychology and business, they too, those colleagues are not taking our chairs away. Right? It is the power structure that is taking it away. And those can be close and they can be removed. But issues of power and status, just as Hochschild noted originally, and as all sociologists of emotion recognize when we can remember what we're doing, that it is the power. And I just want to, because I am about to go back and have to deal with these issues in my own position, we need to remember to bring the joy to our interaction rituals and do what we can with one another in collectivity, in relationship, in community, broadly defined. And not just our colleagues in sociology, but across the enterprise, and also asking our students, if we're lucky enough to be in those conditions, how are you doing, what do you need, and how can I help? Because we all have agency, and if we're doing that together, and if we can bring our departments and our colleagues along, we have a lot better chance to keep hope culture alive and to make a difference in our own institutional settings, which right now we need to do as well. So I think the notion that the work emotionally has to include joy, as Sarah's sort of prompt to this session noted, we can't keep going without it. And we also can't lose touch of the fact that people